Hello and welcome to our Properties of Water lecture. As I'm going through the material, make sure you're filling in the Properties of Water note sheet. As always, wherever you see a yellow box, please fill in the proper vocabulary word that belongs in that box. They are all bolded on the slides, which I'm going over right now. This lecture is a review of the material that we've been learning over the past couple of weeks. So this should all be familiar to you. This has to do with water, the structure of water, polarity, hydrogen bonding, etc. So to start off, water molecules on the most basic level are made up of one oxygen atom covalently bonded to two hydrogen atoms. So we went over covalent bonds in the past. Remember, covalent bonds are the sharing of electrons. So oxygen atoms share one electron with hydrogen to form a covalent bond, and that is pictured right here. Water molecules are electrically neutral, which means they have an even number of protons and electrons, an even number of positive and negative charges. And this structure, or the water structure rather, gives that very unique properties that contribute not only to its function but to life on Earth. Life on Earth exists because water has these very, very unique properties. So one of the major properties that is really unique to water is polarity. All right, so water is an example of a polar molecule. And when you're looking at molecules, they can be classified as either polar, like water, or nonpolar. So polarity in general is the separation of electrical charge. So it's the separation of positive charges and negative charges between covalently bonded atoms within a single molecule. So what that means is on one side of the molecule, you'll have some positive charge, and on the other side of the molecule, or on the other atom rather, you'll have negative charges. It's this separation, this distinction of charge within a single molecule. So in order to have polar molecules, or to achieve a polar molecule, certain atoms within the molecule have the ability to attract the shared electrons towards themselves. And one atom, or one element in particular that we've been talking about a lot, is oxygen. Oxygen is very, very electronegative, which means that oxygen can attract the electrons in the covalent bond towards itself, and it pulls these electrons away from other atoms in the covalent bond. So in your note sheets, I recommend putting in parentheses electronegative. I forgot to put that in the note sheet, but if you would like to, next to this definition right here, I would type in electronegative and bold it, because that is what we're talking about. We're talking about electronegativity and electronegative atoms. All right, so when you have an electronegative atom and it's pulling the electrons away or towards one atom and away from others, this pull for the electrons, this hogging of the electrons, creates that separation of charge that creates the polar molecule. So here's your formal definition. Polar molecules are molecules where electrons are not evenly distributed across the whole molecule, aka there is a separation of charge, and the molecule has a negative pole and a positive pole. So like a magnet has two poles, a negative and a positive. Magnets also have two poles, a negative and a positive. Polar molecules contain atoms that unevenly track shared pairs of electrons. We went over that already. So this is an example of a water molecule. So water molecule has two poles. It has a negative pole and a positive pole. And we said that oxygen is an electronegative atom. So this oxygen atom is going to attract the shared electrons towards itself and away from these hydrogens. So because this is more electronegative than hydrogen, these electrons, these covalent bonds, are going towards oxygen's nucleus and away from hydrogen. This region of the water molecule is negative. This region of the water molecule is positive. Negative pole, positive pole. So water is a polar molecule. Oxygen has 8 protons that attract the shared electrons more strongly than the single proton in either of the hydrogen atoms. So that's the reason why electronegative atoms can pull those electrons. Oxygen has 8 protons, a really highly positive charge in its nucleus. They are attracted to the negative charge. They can pull those electrons towards itself. We went over this as well. Oxygen atom has a partial negative charge, while the hydrogen atoms have a partial positive charge. I want to make this really clear. We've been going over this a lot, but you all should hopefully understand this by now. Here's another example of covalently bonded molecules and polarity. So this is our water molecule. We can see that the arrows are showing us that the oxygen atom is pulling those electrons towards itself. The dipole movement, or the polarity, it's going towards oxygen. This molecule is carbon dioxide, so this is a nonpolar molecule, and it's showing us that these oxygen atoms are pulling the electrons towards themselves away from carbon, but the molecule is symmetrical, which means there's two oxygen atoms, so there is no dipole, which means that there's no separation of charge. So now we're going to focus on nonpolar molecules. Nonpolar molecules are molecules where electrons are shared equally between the atoms in the molecule, aka there is no separation of charge and there is no region where we have a positive pole and a negative pole. The whole thing is evenly distributed. So carbon dioxide, like I said, is an example of a nonpolar molecule. Methane, this is an example of methane, is also a nonpolar molecule. So the electrons are evenly distributed between all four sides of the molecule. So there is no net dipole, no movement, or no separation of charge. So we're going to focus on water now. Water, as we said, is a polar molecule. It has a negative region, which is the oxygen atom, and then the positive region, which is the hydrogens. Because water is polar, polar molecules are able to form what are called hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds are weak chemical bonds that form between different polar molecules that contain hydrogen atoms. It's called a hydrogen bond. The molecules need to contain hydrogen atoms. What's interesting about hydrogen bonds is that it is an attraction between negative and positive charges. So we know that opposites attract. A negative charge is attracted to a positive charge. For hydrogen bonds, we know that hydrogen is partial positive. So that positive charge is attracted to a partial negative atom on another molecule. All right. So take a look at this, this model right here. Water molecules are involved in hydrogen bonding, like I said, because it's polar, water is partial positive. These hydrogens are partial positive. They are attracted to the partial negative of other oxygen atoms. And water molecules can typically take place in 3 to 4 hydrogen bonds at one time. This is another model that I wanted to show you. I liked this one because it distinguished between covalent bonds and hydrogen bonds. So remember, hydrogen bonds are between different water molecules, okay? It's between one water molecule and another water molecule, and it's the attraction between the negative oxygen and the positive hydrogen. Covalent bonds are the sharing of electrons. These are really strong bonds, remember that. And they form between different atoms to form a single molecule. So to form a water molecule, one water molecule, you have covalent bonds between oxygen and hydrogen. And then to form hydrogen bonds, those are between different water molecules. So now that we understand polarity and we understand that water is polar and can engage in hydrogen bonding, let's talk about the properties of water. So water, like we said, is a polar molecule. It's able to form hydrogen bonds. Because of that, water is able to engage in some interesting behaviors, has some interesting properties, including cohesion and surface tension, adhesion, and water as a solvent. So we're going to talk about cohesion first. As we learned in our lab experiment, our properties of water lab, cohesion is an attraction between molecules of the same substance. All right. So if we're talking about water, it's an attraction between water molecules. One single molecule can be involved in as many as 4 hydrogen bonds at once. So remember, hydrogen bonding is the attraction. In water's case, it's the attraction of water molecules to themselves. So that is an example of cohesion. We have it pictured right here. Hydrogen bonding is when water molecules are attracted to other water molecules. So that creates cohesion. Cohesion causes water molecules to come together, which is why drops of water form as beads. So if you're ever in the car when it's raining, you'll probably notice that those raindrops, they form like little beads on your windows. That is because of cohesion. Water is really cohesive, so it comes together, it's attracted to itself, and instead of just flowing down, it forms these little beads on your windows or the hood of your car or whatever. In our lab, we looked at cohesion when we dropped water on the surface of the penny. So we saw that we could drop a lot of water on the surface of a penny, right? A lot of water without it breaking. That's an example of cohesion. So the water was attracted to itself. So instead of just spilling over the side of the penny, it formed that dome shape. So that's cohesion. Cohesion between water molecules also produces what's called surface tension. And this is a property that allows the surface of a liquid to exist in external force. So if you have high surface tension, it's unlikely that you can break the surface of a liquid. So water is an example of a molecule that has really high surface tension. So it's really hard to break the surface of water. We also saw that in our penny lab because we saw that we got more water to fit on the surface of the penny than oil. Water has a higher surface tension, which means it's harder to break the water. It's harder. It took more drops of water to break the surface of the water, as opposed to oil. It took less drops of oil. The oil was more likely to overflow onto the table because the surface tension of oil is lower than that of water. Here's a great example of surface tension. So bugs, insects, raft spiders, things like that are able to walk on the surface of water. You'll see the water bends, but it does not break. That's an example of surface tension. Okay, so water has a high surface tension. Bugs, small insects, light insects can walk on the surface without them falling into the water. Adhesion is our next property. And adhesion is an attraction between molecules of different substances. So we're talking about water. Water is one substance. So adhesion is the attraction between water molecules and another substance. I'm going to use, for this presentation, I'm using the example of glass. So water is attracted to glass molecules, or the molecules that make up glass. So if you put a glass tube into water, so for example, if you had a glass straw, or a glass, what's called capillary tube. It's these very skinny, narrow glass cylinders. If you put a capillary tube into water, you'll see that the sides of the water are higher than what's called the meniscus. So you'll see that on the sides, the water goes up, and in the middle, the water kind of goes down. It makes this U shape. This is an example of adhesion. So this is showing us that water molecules are attracted to the glass. So they're sticking, or they're creating those like weak bonds with the glass molecules. Whereas in the middle of the water is not close to the glass. So it's not attracted to it, so it will fall down in the middle. So adhesion between water molecules and glass molecules is stronger than the cohesion between water molecules. So cohesion is right here. The water molecules are sticking together in this tube, but adhesion is stronger, which is why you create this U shape in the capillary tube. Adhesion causes what's called capillary action. So when you stick a glass tube in water, you'll see that the water starts to go up. That is capillary action. So capillary action is when water is drawn out of the tube. It also happens in plants. So in plants, we know that water moves up the plant from the roots to the leaves. This is an example of capillary action. It's a force that is drawing the water up from the roots to the leaves. In our lab, we looked at adhesion when we saw cut white flowers and celery placed into colored water. We saw that when it was placed into colored water, the leaves and the petals changed colors. And that is an example of adhesion and capillary action in action, right? We saw with our eyes that water was able to move from the bottom of the plant to the top of the plant. And that is because there was an attraction between the water molecules, the plants, and that allowed for capillary action to occur. The final property of water that we're going to cover is water as a solvent. So mixture is a material composed of two or more elements or compounds that is physically mixed together but not chemically combined. So mixture is a pretty broad term. Mixture covers a bunch of things. We are going to focus on a particular mixture called a solution. Examples of mixtures include salt and pepper stirred together. Again, these are two different properties, but they are not chemically combined. They're just sitting in a bowl together. Earth's atmosphere is a mixture of nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and other gases. Like I said, we're going to be focusing on solutions. So solutions are a type of mixture. And solutions are mixtures where all components, so everything in the mixture, is evenly distributed. In a mixture, or in a solution rather, you have two things, a solute and a solvent. So the solute is the substance that is dissolved, and the solvent is the substance in which the solute dissolves. So if we have a solution that contains water and salt, for example, salt is being dissolved into water. Salt is our solute, and then solvent is dissolving the salt. Water is dissolving the salt. Water is the solvent. Here's a little graphic that shows a solution, and it's pointing to the solute and the solvent. For our last slide, we're going over water. So we said water is actually a really great substance because it's able to dissolve several different molecules and compounds. And water is really a great solvent because it's polar. So water's polarity gives it the ability to dissolve polar molecules, all right? So if you have a polar molecule, water is also polar. Because water is polar, it will dissolve those polar molecules. I think a good saying that one of my biology teachers taught me, and what I recommend you type in the slide or type in your note sheet, is like likes like, or like dissolves like. So water is polar. For example, sugar is polar. We saw in the lab that water dissolved sugar really easily. Those sugar disappeared in the water, right? Water is polar, sugar is polar. Like dissolves like. Water will dissolve sugar. All right. And I gave you that example here. Sucrose is polar, water is polar. Because they're both polar, water will dissolve the sucrose. And here's a little graphic to show you that the water surrounds the sucrose molecules and it dissolves them. We noticed in our lab that water does not dissolve oil. Water is polar, oil is nonpolar. They are not the same. Like dissolves like. So oil will not dissolve water will not dissolve oil because they're not the same polarity. Water is polar, oil is nonpolar. And that is it for this presentation. Make sure you have all the vocabulary words and then submit the note sheet for your homework assignment when you're done.